The morning air in Nethercombe carried that peculiar mixture of dew and damp stone which the villagers always remarked upon, as though it were an ingredient in local character. Mr. Bletchley, the parish clerk, was first to arrive at St. Barnabas's church, his shoes muffled against the flagstones. The bell rope hung slack, brushing the polished floorboards, but what arrested his attention, and slightly unsettled the otherwise unflappable Mr. Bletchley, was the unmistakable presence of a body. It lay with an almost absurd stiffness, the arms awkwardly folded, as if in silent reproach, the expression on the face a fixed caricature of surprise. Inspector Purbright arrived without fanfare, accompanied by his habitual calm and a notebook already half filled with observations of minor civil disturbances. He approached the scene with deliberate slowness, noting the angle of the rope, the slight scuff marks on the floor, and the careful distance the parish clerk maintained from the body. Villagers began to gather outside the iron gates, peering over shoulders and murmuring in tones that betrayed more curiosity than alarm. Mrs. Havisham, wearing gloves too white for practical work and a hat of uncertain modesty, fretted about the disruption to the Sunday sermon. Her concern was precise, her worry sculpted from equal parts propriety and self-interest. "Quite unfortunate, is it not?" she murmured, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough for Mr. Fallow, the churchwarden, to register her opinion. Purbright inclined his head politely, but made no immediate response. He had long learned the inefficiency of reassurance in moments of social unease. The act of listening, he knew, often revealed more than words themselves. His eyes lingered on the corpse, noting its remarkably meticulous attire and the fine dusting of flour from the church kitchen on one cuff, evidence of some recent domestic engagement. The position of the body suggested neither struggle nor resistance, a detail that immediately set the inspector to considering the possibility of intent rather than accident. The villagers' whispers carried hints of suspicion and faint indignation. It was, Purbright thought, a chorus of very polite panic. Perhaps it was an unfortunate misstep during bell maintenance, Mr. Fallow offered with awkward decisiveness. A pause, then a rapid adjustment of spectacles and a slight clearing of the throat suggested that the statement was simultaneously an observation and an absolution. No one contradicted him. Purbright's mind catalogued these subtleties as if arranging flowers, the distance maintained, the slight twitch of a glove, the murmured inquiries about timing and responsibility. He noted, too, that certain parishioners had appeared unusually early that morning, ostensibly to assist with the bell's upkeep, and now hovered at the edge of the gathering with expressions carefully neutral. Among them, Mrs. Broadwater of the parish charity seemed singularly attentive to the angle of the rope, though she claimed she was merely concerned for the dignity of the proceedings. A small note lay at the foot of the rope, folded with meticulous care. Purbright picked it up, noting the faint smear of ink along the edge. The writing was precise, almost obsessively neat, reading in part, "Old grievances are not easily set aside." It was unsigned, yet suggested a familiarity with the victim's habits and social peccadilloes. The inspector's mind catalogued the possibilities, not with urgency, but with the methodical deliberation of a man who understood the slow architecture of human folly. The vicar arrived then, a man whose voice was polished by decades of morning prayers and committee reports. He coughed discreetly, adjusted his vestments, and gestured toward the congregation with understated authority. "We must, I suppose, maintain composure," he said, selecting his words as if they were ledger entries. "The community's order ought not to be disturbed by unfortunate circumstances." Purbright observed the subtle anxiety beneath the vicar's calm. There was a faint tightness around the eyes, a careful modulation in tone intended to reassure yet simultaneously impress upon listeners that moral propriety remained paramount. The inspector wondered how much of Nethercombe's social equilibrium depended upon these quiet exercises in authority, and how much might now tremble under the weight of curiosity and conjecture. Questions were posed, soft, indirect, courteous, and ultimately revealing. Who had last seen the deceased? Was the bell rope regularly checked? Had there been any disputes concerning maintenance or ceremony? Each response was measured, evasive in its own genteel manner. A hedge dispute from last summer emerged, a disagreement over pew allocations, even the slight misplacement of a newsletter, all recounted with the gravity of near-catastrophic events. Purbright took notes with mild amusement. Human pettiness, he thought, could be lethal in its quiet accumulation. By late morning, the crowd dispersed under polite urging. Purbright lingered, examining the angle of the rope, the placement of the note, and the small footprint that suggested someone had adjusted the scene with deliberate care. The air, once simply damp, now felt heavy with unspoken judgments and subtle accusation. A faint knock at the vestry door drew his attention. A parishioner, one of those who had hovered discreetly, now held a small item, a brooch or insignia, found near the scene. She offered it with neither flourish nor commentary, simply placing it in Purbright's hand. The inspector examined it thoughtfully. Its presence was trivial, perhaps accidental, yet its very discovery raised an immediate question. Had someone intended to leave it as a signal, a signature, or merely an inadvertent trace of presence? The answer was not forthcoming, but the silent suggestion was unmistakable. Nethercombe, he noted, had whispered its first secret. The morning post in Nethercombe was a ritual observed with the precision of a village clock, each item carefully sorted, stamped and weighed, not only for postage but for propriety. Inspector Purbright arrived at Mr. Clement Harrow's residence to examine correspondence, not with urgency, but with the deliberate curiosity of a man accustomed to tracing human temperament through ink and paper. The house, a tidy brick affair with wisteria carefully restrained to the walls, bore the faint aroma of boiled tea and damp newspapers. Harrow's study, preserved with almost obsessive care, contained stacks of letters, neatly tied with ribbon, as though the correspondence itself demanded ceremonial respect. Purbright, noting the careful placement of the bundles, began with the unopened letters, examining envelopes for subtle details, smudged seals, variations in handwriting, and the faint pressure of a finger along the crease. He recognized the pattern of small affronts, social obligations, and meticulously polite complaints. One letter, in particularly neat copperplate, was from Mrs. Havisham, voicing concern over Harrow's recent insistence that minutes of the Wome N's reading circle be rewritten to correct grammatical inconsistencies. The message, though courteous, carried a barely perceptible undertone of indignation, a veiled admonition delivered with embroidered civility. "I trust these matters may be addressed without undue inconvenience," the letter read, as though the inconvenience were both a factual observation and a subtle moral judgment. Purbright filed it mentally under minor irritations capable of generating disproportionate resentment. He could already imagine Mrs. Havisham recounting it at tea, each word chosen to suggest, rather than state, the victim's tiresome fastidiousness. Several letters bore the insignia of the parish charity. They were more cryptic, containing thinly veiled references to financial contributions and procedural errors. The tone was firm, yet civil, indicating the writer's acute awareness of social boundaries. Purbright noted one particularly pointed reference to an accounting discrepancy, phrased as a request for rectification rather than an accusation. The choice of words, he reflected, revealed as much about the writer as it did about the deceased, a careful calibration of authority, civility, and latent censure. The postmistress, Mrs. Pritchard, was summoned to assist with identification. Her manner was deferential, hands folded neatly in her apron, yet her eyes flicked with the faint spark of curiosity common to those accustomed to observing both civility and its breaches. She confirmed that Harrow had been unusually diligent in receiving and cataloguing his correspondence, refusing to ignore even minor slights or trivial requests. Letters returned unopened were often rerouted to committees or individuals whose attendance he considered substandard, ensuring that every slight or perceived slight was noted. Purbright made a mental note of this habit a meticulous observer could provoke. Resentment even without intention. Among the letters, one small envelope drew his attention for its apparent triviality. Its handwriting was unfamiliar, the ink slightly faded, and the phrasing faintly archaic. Inside, a single line suggested that old grievances might yet demand recognition. Purbright's mind turned to the network of committees, the delicate arrangements of seating, the minor disputes over pew placement, flower arrangements, and bell maintenance. Nethercombe's social fabric, he mused, consisted as much of restraint and etiquette as of friendliness. Each letter was a thread in a quietly taut web. He placed the note aside and examined invitations to various parish functions, committee meetings, flower shows, and the annual harvest supper. Most were unremarkable in tone, yet Purbright detected subtle variations in phrasing. A request to honor the gathering with your presence could, with slight inflection, become a challenge to propriety, an insinuation that one's absence would constitute moral failure. Harrow's careful cataloguing of such communications suggested a man not merely dutiful, but acutely conscious of the reputational implications of minor social errors. Mrs. Broadwater, chair of the parish charity, arrived to discuss these matters. She was formally polite, yet her fingers fidgeted with her brooch, an unconscious gesture betraying tension beneath composure. She described Harrow's meticulous attention to committee work, emphasizing both his diligence and the irritation it caused others. "It is, of course, necessary to maintain standards," she remarked, her tone indicating that such maintenance sometimes exacted a toll on social harmony. Purbright noted the subtle interplay, civility masking grievance, authority veiled by politeness, and resentment expressed indirectly through concern for communal order. During their discussion, a servant, entered quietly, delivering a small envelope addressed to Purbright, bearing no seal or signature. It contained only a note: "Observe the newsletters, the truth lies in omission." The phrasing was elliptical, the implication deliberate. Purbright considered it carefully, noting that omission, what was left unrecorded, ignored, or neglected, might reveal far more about Nethercombe's dynamics than any overt complaint. The inspector's thoughts turned to the delicate lattice of correspondences, invitations, and minor disputes he had examined that morning. Something previously overlooked seemed suddenly significant. As he left Harrow's study, Purbright paused by the window, watching the village awaken to its routines, unaware that the invisible structures of etiquette, habit, and subtle antagonism might have conspired to produce far-reaching consequences. Letters, invitations, and polite admonitions were no longer trivial. They had become instruments of influence, capable of shaping behavior, fostering resentment, and, perhaps, precipitating unforeseen events. A faint shadow of anticipation lingered, quiet but insistent, as Purbright considered which among the villagers had chosen to wield civility as a weapon, and what small, deliberate act might next reveal the orchestrator's hand. The village hall of Nethercombe, a modest brick building with varnished benches and an odor faintly reminiscent of boiled cabbage and old ink, was the venue for the morning's committee meeting. Inspector Purbright arrived promptly, noting the careful arrangement of chairs and the almost ritualistic placement of minutes, ledgers, and hymn books. The members of the parish council had assembled with characteristic punctuality, each bearing the precise expression suitable for an encounter with both authority and propriety. Purbright's arrival, though understated, seemed to unsettle the equilibrium by the merest fraction of an inch. Mr. Fallow, the church warden, rose with an air of formal courtesy, adjusting spectacles and clearing his throat in a manner that suggested both nervousness and self-importance. "Inspector Purbright," he said, "we are entirely at your disposal for any inquiries concerning unfortunate events." The slight hesitation over the final words was notable, as though the act of verbalizing them carried a hidden moral weight. Purbright inclined his head politely and began to observe the assembled committee with the meticulous patience of a man accustomed to reading subtle gestures. The discussion commenced with the routine approval of minutes, an exercise in civility that revealed more about character than any incident of direct confrontation could. Mr. Fallow and Mrs. Havisham, the latter armed with spectacles and a muffled sense of propriety, exchanged brief, guarded glances over the ledger. The inspector noted the almost imperceptible tightening of Mrs. Havisham's lips, as if she were measuring the impact of each phrase upon the ears of others. It was a tableau of restrained anxiety, politeness intertwined with vigilance, decorum interlaced with suspicion. Purbright, silently cataloguing these minute gestures, asked a few formal questions regarding Mr. Harrow's last interactions with the committee. Responses were careful, indirect, and punctuated by frequent pauses that conveyed both deliberation and subtle evasion. Mr. Fallow, recalling a dispute over the placement of a hymn book rack, emphasized Harrow's insistence on correctness. "Of course," he added, "one must respect the rules, though some might find them somewhat rigid." His intonation implied both critique and moral distancing, a polite signal that blame, if present, could be distributed without accusation. Mrs. Broadwater, chair of the parish charity, joined the conversation with deliberate precision. Her manner was formally composed, yet the slight tremor in her gloved hands betrayed restrained irritation. Mr. Harrow had, naturally, his views on procedural matters, she observed. One might say they were particularly insistent at times. The inspector discerned the gentle undercurrent of reproach, the subtle implication that Harrow's attention to detail had occasioned frustration without necessitating overt confrontation. It was an elegant display of social censure, carefully veiled behind civility. Purbright probed further, inquiring about minor disagreements in the weeks preceding the unfortunate event. References were made to the flower show judging, the allocation of pews for seasonal observances, and the precise calibration of committee votes. Each anecdote was offered with an air of careful neutrality, though the inspector detected undercurrents of personal grievance. Mrs. Havisham, in particular, recounted a seemingly trivial incident involving a misplaced ledger, her voice delicately modulating between regret and implied condemnation. It was, Purbright noted, a skillful exercise in social equilibrium, grievance expressed, yet repackaged as concern for communal order. During a brief adjournment for tea, the inspector observed the subtle hierarchy of interactions, eyes flicking toward the vicar's chair, whispers measured to avoid offense, and gestures of acknowledgement restrained by long-standing conventions. He noted that several committee members appeared unusually eager to maintain civility, as though the mere presence of authority magnified the consequences of misstep. Their politeness, however, was not empty. It concealed a lattice of anxieties, each slight misalignment hinting at unspoken resentments and private judgments. Purbright returned to formal questioning, focusing on Mr. Harrow's habits of correspondence and critique. Letters, it emerged, had been circulated with meticulous care, some containing minor corrections to meeting minutes or gently suggested procedural amendments. These were invariably acknowledged with an air of reluctant acquiescence or polite correction. Purbright noted that the cumulative effect of such correspondence, though superficially benign, could easily engender irritation. The victim's insistence on propriety, he reflected, had a peculiar way of intensifying latent tensions, producing a climate of mild but persistent unease. Toward the end of the session, a minor but telling incident occurred. Mrs. Havisham, reaching for a sugar bowl, allowed her hand to brush against a folded sheet of paper tucked beneath the teapot. Her eyes widened slightly, though she replaced it with quiet discretion. Purbright, observing this gesture, made a mental note. It was a subtle clue, almost imperceptible, suggesting that even in ritualized civility, certain communications might pass under the radar, unnoticed by all but the most attentive observer. As the meeting adjourned, Purbright lingered, reflecting on the delicate lattice of civility, grievance, and restrained observation he had witnessed. Each member departed with outward composure intact, yet the air carried the faint residue of unsaid judgments and private anxieties. The inspector, considering the notes, letters, and gestures, perceived a pattern emerging. The orchestration of social propriety, when combined with meticulous attention to minor slights, could easily produce consequences unforeseen. The brief brush with the folded paper, the faintest ripple of potential revelation, suggested that Nethercombe still held secrets, waiting to be uncovered with quiet, deliberate observation. Purbright left the village hall with the sense that the day's inquiries had revealed more in their silences than in their statements. In Nethercombe, he reflected, civility could be as revealing as candor, and subtlety as damning as overt accusation. The inspector's gaze lingered on the departing committee members, each posture and gesture catalogued with careful attention. Somewhere, within the lattice of politeness and small grievances, lay a truth yet unspoken, and it was poised, perhaps, to announce itself through the slightest slip, the faintest hint, or the quietest gesture. The Church of St. Barnabas wore its Sunday calm with a studied decorum, as though every pew and polished floorboard had rehearsed its own posture in preparation for inspection. Inspector Purbright arrived before the congregation, taking a seat at the rear, his eyes surveying both architecture and parishioners with quiet attentiveness. The morning light fell through stained glass, casting muted color across faces that were carefully neutral yet not without trace of anticipation. The bell rope, now repaired, hung innocuously, but its prior presence lingered in unspoken consciousness. Every footfall, every shuffle of hymn book pages seemed to echo with memory of the recent discovery. The congregation settled with ritual precision. Mrs. Havisham, perched mid-aisle with gloves clasped and shoulders rigid, maintained her usual air of dignified apprehension. Mr. Fallow, the church warden, adjusted his spectacles repeatedly, each movement a silent reassurance that the proper order had been restored. Purbright, noting the tiny tremor in Fallow's hands and the faint quiver in Mrs. Havisham's lips, catalogued these as evidence of social anxiety rather than fear, though the two were often closely allied in Nethercombe. Even the vicar seemed slightly aware of a heightened audience, his voice modulating carefully between warmth and admonition, as if ensuring that moral propriety was observed in every sermon intonation. The preacher began with customary civility, touching on patience, reconciliation, and the virtues of diligence in small matters. References, accidental or intentional, seemed to hover just above the consciousness of the congregation. Purbright's mind, alert yet unhurried, passed each phrase, a gentle emphasis on resolving disputes, a comment on observing protocol, a reflection on correcting errors without rancor. The sermon, though outwardly benign, carried a resonance particular to those accustomed to navigating Nethercombe's lattice of etiquette. Words were not merely words, they were invitations, cautions, and occasional censure. Harrow's habitual pew, now conspicuously empty, drew quiet attention. Eyes lingered in the briefest of glances, brows slightly raised or lowered to indicate recognition without comment. A faint, collectively agreed-upon acknowledgement of absence passed over the room, an elegant exercise in social observation. Purbright noted the almost imperceptible tension in these glances, civility maintained, yet memory of grievance and expectation pressing gently behind it. The inspector's interest, as always, was in the silences and pauses as much as in the words themselves. During the reading of announcements, subtle adjustments occurred among committee members present. Mrs. Broadwater, chair of the parish charity, seemed particularly vigilant in maintaining decorum while listening to her colleagues' phrasing, occasionally leaning forward, pen poised, as if to record an infraction or note a slight. Each movement, Purbright observed, was measured, deliberate, and socially calibrated. He considered that such attentiveness, when combined with private resentment, could produce consequences far subtler and more effective than overt confrontation. Whispers occasionally floated across pews, soft enough to escape sermon, but loud enough for a careful observer. Remarks concerning the allocation of seating, timing of bell ringing, and Harrow's usual insistence on punctuality were exchanged with courteous modulation. Even minor disagreements about hymn selection seemed freighted with latent significance, each exchange a small indicator of underlying attitudes. Purbright made mental notes of names, gestures, and micro-expressions, sensing the faint patterns of hierarchy and quiet rivalry beneath the veil of collective piety. A brief pause in the sermon afforded Purbright the opportunity to observe a small incident. Young Mr. Sims, tending the organ bench, dropped a folded sheet of paper, retrieving it with an expression carefully neutral. His hands, however, lingered over the document a moment longer than necessary, fingers subtly compressing the folds, as though guarding the contents from all but the most attentive gaze. The gesture, innocuous to an inattentive observer, suggested awareness of some minor yet potentially revealing matter. Purbright filed the observation, noting the quiet precision with which information was both protected and transmitted in Nethercombe's social milieu. As the service concluded, the congregation filed past with customary courtesy, each handshake, nod, and murmur carefully calibrated. Mrs. Havisham offered a faint, almost imperceptible glance toward the rear pew where Harrow would have sat. It was not curiosity alone, nor mere habitual acknowledgement, but something subtler, recognition of absence, coupled with an unspoken query, a silent calibration of responsibility and propriety. Purbright, observing from his seat, considered the weight of such small gestures. After the congregation dispersed, the inspector lingered, noting the careful positioning of hymnals, the precise folding of sheets, and the subtle removal of one pew cushion, which had apparently been nudged by some attentive hand. A folded pamphlet remained partially visible beneath it, a small irregularity that suggested intentional concealment or inadvertent revelation. Purbright retrieved it with measured care. The cover was unmarked, yet the faint impression of handwriting could be discerned beneath the surface, hinting at information meant for careful eyes only. With the parish emptied of its formal audience, Purbright considered the interplay of words, gestures, and absences. The sermon had been outwardly a lesson in patience and propriety, yet underneath it had become a lens through which to observe Nethercombe's social choreography. The small gestures, the glance, the folded sheet, the unnoticed pamphlet, hinted at concealed motives and private anxieties. Somewhere within these subtleties, Purbright reflected, lay the next clue, a signal, an omission, or perhaps a deliberate message waiting to be noticed by the precise observer. The morning sun slanted across Nethercombe's village green with a civility peculiar to early spring, illuminating hedgerows, cobbled paths, and the neatly trimmed lawns of those who took both pride and mild offence in their domestic presentation. Inspector Purbright, noting the neatness of the setting as if it were itself a character, made his way toward Mr. Sims' cottage at the edge of the green. The gardener, elderly but sprightly in posture, greeted him with the carefully modulated warmth typical of Nethercombe folk, polite, restrained, and always carrying an unspoken awareness of propriety. "Inspector," said Mr. Sims, "it's a singular occasion to have such a visitor." His voice was low, courteous, and slightly tremulous, betraying just enough nervousness to suggest careful consideration rather than mere age. Purbright inclined his head. "I am here regarding Mr. Harrow," he said. "If you could recount any recent observations, however minor, it would be appreciated." Sims led the inspector through his small, well-tended garden, pausing at flower beds and clipped hedges as though each were a topic demanding precise commentary. He spoke first of Mr. Harrow's habit of inspecting the church grounds, noting the bell rope, the lawn edging, and the condition of the hedges with meticulous attention. He would often remark on the alignment of these things, Sims said, gesturing to a row of daffodils that leaned slightly in the morning sun. A crooked hedge or misplaced stone could provoke considerable commentary. His hands, calloused and precise, mimed the adjustments, illustrating points that were both trivial and revealing. Purbright listened, noting the intersection of minor grievances and social responsibility. A misplaced stone, an untrimmed hedge, or a slightly askew flower bed might seem inconsequential, yet within Nethercombe's lattice of civility and hierarchy, such infractions could carry moral weight. "And were there any disagreements?" he asked, in that low, courteous tone that encouraged both honesty and discretion. "Ah," said Sims, shifting his weight, "there were moments of friction. Nothing grievous, of course, but disputes over flower shows, the timing of bell maintenance, and the arrangement of seating for parish events." He paused, glancing sidelong as though ensuring that the inspector would understand without explicit accusation. Mr. Harrow had a keen sense of propriety. Some of the committee did not always share his enthusiasm for minute precision. Purbright noted the careful phrasing. Friction, not argument, did not always share, not refusal. Nethercombe's social fabric, he reflected, was maintained through nuanced language, deliberate understatement, and avoidance of overt confrontation. Even in discussing minor disagreements, the subtext revealed a lattice of subtle resentments, calibrated gestures, and concealed irritation. The gardener led Purbright to the rear of the churchyard, where the bell rope hung taut from its repaired position. "I was called early that morning," Sims said, "though I cannot claim to have seen anything particular before the discovery. Only afterward did one notice the precise positioning." He touched the rope with gloved fingers, demonstrating a careful angle. It seemed deliberate, almost as though it had been arranged for effect. Purbright inclined his head thoughtfully. The statement was neither accusation nor speculation, yet its quiet precision suggested that the gardener had noted both the improbability and the subtle artistry of the scene. Nethercombe, as he had observed in letters, committee minutes, and sermons, possessed a preoccupation with order and presentation. Even minor disturbances were filtered through aesthetic and moral judgment. They walked back toward the cottage along a narrow path, flanked by neatly clipped privet. Sims recounted a particular episode concerning a disagreement over the flower show schedule, during which Harrow had expressed, politely but firmly, dissatisfaction with the committee's efficiency. The matter had been resolved with overt civility, yet Purbright sensed the lingering trace of irritation, the kind that persisted in small gestures, a stiffened shoulder, a withheld compliment, a glance held too long. Social correction, he reflected, was often more powerful than confrontation. As the inspector prepared to take leave, Sims paused at the gate, one hand resting on the latch. "There is a minor detail," he said carefully. "I noticed a small disturbance among the flower beds shortly before the discovery. Nothing of consequence, though it seemed out of place, as if someone had been there very recently. Perhaps a bird, perhaps, well, one cannot say for certain." His eyes were steady, yet the phrase carried the faintest S. A gesture of observation withheld, a possibility quietly recorded. Purbright thanked him and stepped onto the path leading back toward the village, the orderly arrangement of gardens, hedges, and flower beds now reframed as evidence of more than aesthetic concern. Small perturbations, subtle gestures, and the precise placement of objects could convey information as clearly as words. The minor disturbance, Sims' hesitation, and the faint implication of recent activity combined to form a delicate thread of inquiry. Somewhere within this lattice of civility, minor grievance, and understated observation, Purbright reflected, lay a clue that would prove pivotal, if only the observer remained patient and attentive. He paused briefly at the edge of the green, glancing back toward the cottages, where curtains had shifted and a window reflected a figure who might have been watching them leave. It was an ordinary gesture, almost imperceptible, yet it carried with it the faintest trace of awareness, and perhaps anticipation. Nethercombe, he realized, had already begun to reveal its secrets, not with dramatics, but in quiet, deliberate signals as subtle as the morning light across the hedges. The village hall, ordinarily reserved for committee meetings and the occasional concert, had been transformed for the weekly tea, its polished tables adorned with lace cloths and modest floral arrangements. Inspector Purbright arrived promptly, noting the deliberate spacing of chairs, the careful arrangement of sandwiches, and the soft murmur of conversation that seemed to hover between politeness and apprehension. Nethercombe, he reflected, treated even the simplest gatherings as an exercise in order, subtle hierarchy, and social calibration. Mrs. Havisham presided over one table with an almost ceremonial attention to detail, adjusting napkins, straightening cups, and ensuring that all jest. Ures maintained appropriate civility. Her gloved hands moved with precision, and yet her eyes flickered toward Purbright, registering the inspector's arrival with a mixture of formal respect and faint anticipation. Mr. Fallow, seated nearby, maintained a similar poise, though the slight quiver in his hand suggested anxiety thinly disguised as ritual. Purbright, seated at the periphery, catalogued these micro-expressions with unobtrusive attention. The tea proceeded in polite rhythm, gentle introductions, measured comments on weather and parish business, and murmured compliments regarding recent flower arrangements. Conversation was carefully circumscribed, though subtle cues betrayed underlying tension. References to Mr. Harrow, though ostensibly respectful, occasionally carried a faint edge of critique, as if remembrance itself demanded justification. Mrs. Broadwater, chair of the parish charity, engaged with neighbours in what appeared to be innocuous discussion, yet her measured phrasing suggested vigilance, a quiet watchfulness over who said what and to whom. Purbright observed the distribution of attentiveness. Eyes occasionally lingered too long on hands, napkins, or sugar tongs. Posture was precise, yet deliberate adjustments betrayed private anxieties. Whispers, barely audible, often ceased as he turned his attention, though the pause itself seemed a form of communication, acknowledgement that one's observation was now being monitored. It was a dance of civility, a web of etiquette through which Nethercombe measured loyalty, discretion, and reputation. A discussion arose concerning the upcoming flower show, ostensibly about categories and schedules, but Purbright discerned subtle undercurrents. Mr. Sims, the gardener, noted discrepancies in prior awards, phrasing his observation in the most courteous terms. One might consider with discretion that certain all occasions could be reviewed for consistency. Mrs. Havisham responded with a delicate, measured laugh, acknowledging his concern while asserting her own authority indeed, though we must be careful not to overemphasize minor inconsistencies. Perfection, after all, is often a matter of perspective. The conversation, while outwardly civil, contained multiple layers. Words acted as signals, phrases were shields, compliments contained faint admonitions. Purbright noted that minor social grievances had been artfully disguised as observations on procedure and propriety. In Nethercombe, subtlety was currency, and even the most mundane tea gathering could serve as a forum for influence and quiet assertion of dominance. At one point, Purbright's attention was drawn to a small incident that could easily have gone unnoticed. A folded piece of paper slipped from under a sugar bowl as Mrs. Havisham adjusted it, remaining partially visible for the briefest moment. She replaced it almost immediately, glancing toward the inspector with an expression carefully neutral, as though daring anyone to notice. The gesture, fleeting and seemingly inconsequential, suggested awareness of both the document's significance and the importance of discretion. Purbright made a mental note. In Nethercombe, the smallest movement could reveal or conceal intentions. Meanwhile, tea and sandwiches were consumed with proper restraint, punctuated by observations on the mild weather, parish committees, and recent gardening successes. Each remark, though polite, carried subtle social information, favor, disapproval, and quiet warning encoded in tone, emphasis, and timing. Purbright recorded each nuance, aware that in a village so attuned to etiquette, the interplay of civility and minor reproach could elucidate hidden tensions and motives more effectively than any overt confrontation. As the gathering began to disperse, Purbright noted a final, understated occurrence. Mrs. Broadwater, standing to leave, allowed a book, an inconspicuous parish newsletter, to protrude slightly from beneath her arm. Its cover was casual, yet the crease indicated recent handling. A shadow of hesitation flickered across her face, almost imperceptible, as if she were unsure whether to leave it behind or remove it. Purbright's gaze lingered, aware that what was withheld might carry as much meaning as what was displayed. With the hall emptied save for the inspector, the remaining traces of social choreography, the arrangement of chairs, the slightly displaced napkins, the fallen leaflet, offered a subtle map of interpersonal observation, minor resentments, and carefully concealed intentions. Nethercombe, in its quiet civility, had spoken. Gestures and omissions, rather than words, revealed the village's preoccupations and unspoken judgments. Purbright pocketed the newsletter and considered the implications, aware that the faintest signal, an overlooked gesture or a partially hidden document, might now illuminate a path toward understanding the sequence of minor grievances that had converged upon Mr. Harrow's unfortunate demise. The parish archives were, as Inspector Purbright had long suspected, a repository not merely of events, but of sentiment, moral judgment, and discrete conflict. Rows of ledgers, minutes, and correspondence lay in orderly stacks, each document bound and catalogued with a precision that would have satisfied even Mr. Harrow himself. The musty scent of parchment mingled with the faint aroma of ink and varnish, imparting to the room a weighty sense of history and civility. Purbright moved between the shelves with deliberate care, noting not merely the records themselves, but the manner in which they were preserved, the slight indentations of repeated handling, and the occasional smudge. Betraying human attention, his first inspection concerned the committee minutes from the past 12 months. Each meeting had been recorded with punctilious accuracy, yet subtle discrepancies were apparent. One entry suggested a unanimous vote where subsequent letters hinted at dissent. Another recorded an apology from a member absent on the day in question. Purbright smiled faintly, noting how omission could be as telling as inclusion. Nethercombe, he thought, had long mastered the art of polite disguise, presenting harmony outwardly while masking minor rivalries and personal grievances. Among the letters filed alongside minutes, a series of correspondences from Mrs. Havisham drew particular attention. Carefully folded and sealed, the letters conveyed civility, encouragement, and a perfunctory acknowledgement of compliance. Yet the inspector discerned the faintest edge of admonishment in repeated phrases. References to necessary rectification and attention to detail suggested a long-standing concern with procedural propriety and perhaps a private irritation over Harrow's insistence on exactitude. Each letter, in its precise restraint, carried both content and subtle character insight. Purbright turned his attention to a sequence of newsletters circulated by the parish charity. Most were composed with apparent neutrality, chronicling events and accomplishments with proper decorum. Yet here too the omissions were telling. Harrow's contributions to recent committee initiatives were acknowledged in careful understatement, while other minor irritations were noted with punctilious specificity. It was a deliberate shaping of perception, a means of asserting social judgment without overt criticism. The inspector considered how such manipulations of record, subtle as they were, could cultivate quietly festering resentment over months or years. He paused over a ledger of attendance, noting inconsistencies with a quiet smile. Some names were crossed, annotated with minor remarks that might indicate tardiness or procedural non-compliance. One entry listed Harrow as present at a meeting whose minutes suggested his absence. Another suggested unanimous approval of a proposal despite letters to the contrary. Nethercombe, he reflected, was a village in which civility was meticulously maintained, yet the social lattice supporting it was riddled with private judgments and unspoken disputes. A particular note, tucked between pages of a 1912 committee record, caught his attention. Written in a hand he did not immediately recognize, it remarked, "The small perturbations in the flower beds may presage further disturbance." Purbright's eyes narrowed slightly. The phrasing was indirect, the warning elliptical, yet it hinted at observation and anticipation. Even a minor garden detail, recorded with careful attention, might carry significance when combined with the measured resentment catalogued in minutes and letters. As he continued, the inspector traced references to bell maintenance, pew assignments, and the flower show schedule. Each appeared trivial at first glance, yet patterns emerged. Repeated corrections, quiet admonishments, and subtle signals of disapproval converged to form a lattice of interpersonal friction. Nethercombe's social equilibrium, he noted, relied on adherence to minute formalities, and those who disregarded them, even through inadvertence, invited observation and moral judgment. Harrow, meticulous and assertive in his attention to detail, had been acutely conscious of this lattice, yet his conscientiousness had inevitably irritated those less disciplined. Purbright paused, noticing a small smudge on 1-minute sheet, as if ink had been smeared deliberately or through careless handling. It was minor, yet the placement suggests recent contact. The edge of a note protruded beneath the ledger. He extracted it carefully. The note, in delicate, nearly illegible script, read, "Observe who lingers near the pews, subtle gestures reveal intention." Again, the instruction was indirect, offering insight rather than accusation, suggesting the author had an intimate awareness of village observances, gestures, and hierarchies. A soft knock at the archive door interrupted him. The archivist, an elderly woman of formidable politeness, entered, bearing a bundle of recently filed letters. Her expression was composed, though a subtle arch of an eyebrow suggested she was accustomed to monitoring the movement of inquiries. "Inspector," she said, voice smooth and measured, "some correspondence has arrived that may relate to your inquiries." She placed the bundle gently on the table, stepping back to maintain proper distance and avoid any appearance of impropriety. Purbright examined the letters with measured care, noting handwriting, phrasing, and the faintly strategic timing of their dispatch. The documents contained minor procedural remarks, updates on flower shows, and subtle queries concerning bell maintenance, each couched in decorous language. Yet, in juxtaposition with earlier records, a pattern emerged: attentive, persistent oversight, combined with carefully calibrated civility, could produce unspoken pressure. Nethercombe, he reflected, functioned as a society in which restraint and decorum were instruments of influence, and omission was as potent as expression. As he prepared to leave the archives, Purbright lingered, considering the weight of minor details. The smudge, the hidden note, the quietly distributed letters, all suggested that someone in Nethercombe had a deliberate eye for observation, recording, and signaling. Civility was the vehicle, subtle judgment, the message. He closed the ledger with care, aware that the next clue might reveal itself not in overt statement, but in a gesture, a pause, or the placement of an otherwise inconsequential document. Somewhere within this lattice of propriety and minor grievance, a thread awaited the patient observer. The village hall was unusually animated for midweek, occupied by a rehearsal for the upcoming parish pageant. Inspector Purbright entered quietly, noting the delicate choreography of chairs, music stands, and costume racks. The participants, though engaged in modest theatrics, conducted themselves with a decorous sense of propriety. Every bow, pause, and line reading carried not merely the intention of performance, but the weight of reputation, civility, and social expectation. Nethercombe, he reflected, permitted no occasion, even the rehearsal of a nativity tableau, to escape scrutiny, subtle competition, or minor grievance. Mrs. Havisham, adorned with a shawl slightly askew and a faintly critical expression, directed the allocation of roles with precise authority. "Mr. Sims, the shepherds require careful attention," she intoned, "and please ensure the angel's halo is positioned correctly." Her voice, measured and polite, nevertheless carried the unmistakable trace of admonition. Purbright observed how minor errors in dress or placement could provoke social commentary, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakably evaluative. Even small gestures were instruments of subtle judgment, capable of amplifying tension beneath the veneer of civility. The rehearsal proceeded with deliberate slowness. Lines were read carefully, cues repeated for clarity, and minor disputes over props were resolved through understated negotiation. Mr. Fallow, assigned the role of narrator, hesitated over the pronunciation of certain archaic words. A slight cough from Mrs. Broadwater, ostensibly intended as gentle correction, served also as a quiet reinforcement of hierarchy. Purbright noted that the interplay of instruction, compliance, and polite resistance often revealed more about social alliances than the script itself. As the group practiced a scene involving the shepherd's journey, a minor incident drew the inspector's attention. A folded sheet of music slipped from the piano stand to the floor. Mrs. Havisham picked it up with an air of neutrality, yet the briefest flicker of her gaze toward a committee member suggested awareness beyond mere accident. In Nethercombe, he reflected, even the smallest movement could carry social significance. The placement, concealment, or handling of an object might function as signal or subtle reprimand. Purbright's observations extended beyond gestures to patterns of attention. Eyes lingered over positions of prominence. Hands adjusted costume details with quiet deliberation, and murmured advice was framed as collaborative assistance, yet contained faint traces of critique. The inspector considered how Mr. Harrow's meticulous nature might have intersected with this lattice of minor corrections, subtle rivalry, and the persistent exercise of authority. Each participant, consciously or not, contributed to the gentle pressures and anxieties that shaped group behavior. During a brief pause, Purbright approached the piano, where a small notebook had been left. Its pages contained penciled notes regarding timing, posture, and cueing. Most were mundane, yet one entry, faintly underlined, read, "Observe placement, subtle deviations carry consequence." The phrasing mirrored other instances he had encountered in letters, pamphlets, and parish records. Nethercombe, he reflected, maintained a social order in which propriety was both observed and enforced, quietly, imperceptibly, and persistently. Even rehearsal was a microcosm of moral hierarchy. He then observed the interplay between Mrs. Broadwater and the younger members of the pageant committee. Instructions, offered with apparent neutrality, were met with deference, yet the slight hesitation in one participant's movements suggested an awareness of scrutiny. Purbright catalogued these subtleties, gestures, pauses, and the measured deployment of civility indicated that minor grievances, long remembered, influenced current behavior in imperceptible but meaningful ways. Even cooperation could be conditional, framed by latent hierarchy and social vigilance. A moment arose when a bell rung in preparation for the scene's tableau produced an unintended echo. The sound drew immediate attention. A soft corrective glance from Mrs. Havisham, a discreet adjustment by Mr. Sims, and a barely perceptible stiffening of posture among committee members. The observer would have noted only propriety being maintained. Purbright discerned the undercurrent of moral calibration. In Nethercombe, even incidental noise demanded acknowledgement, for the maintenance of reputation and decorum was ceaseless. As rehearsal concluded, Purbright noted one final subtle occurrence. A participant, otherwise diligent in returning props to their designated places, hesitated with the angel's halo. She glanced toward Mrs. Havisham, then to a small corner of the stage, before carefully placing the object slightly askew. The movement was deliberate yet gentle, almost imperceptible, as though negotiating a balance between observation and autonomy. Purbright filed the detail mentally. Such a minor deviation, inconsequential to the performance, might nonetheless reveal individual disposition, awareness of surveillance, or intent to signal something without words. The hall emptied with the usual decorum, polite acknowledgements, curt nods, and careful footsteps on polished floorboards. The inspector lingered, reflecting on the web of gestures, omissions, and minor corrections he had observed. Nethercombe, he thought, continued to speak in whispers of propriety, in quiet calibrations of conduct, and in subtle signals transmitted through movement and attention. Within the delicate choreography of rehearsal, he sensed that another thread of understanding had been revealed, a faint, almost imperceptible clue that might later illuminate motivations previously concealed by civility. The Gardner estate, modest yet precise in its landscaping, hosted the village garden party with an air of quiet ceremony. Inspector Purbright arrived shortly after midday, noting the careful alignment of chairs, tables, and parasols, each positioned with unspoken attention to symmetry. The lawns were impeccably trimmed, and flower beds, recently pruned, bore subtle evidence of ongoing supervision. Nethercombe, he reflected, treated even casual social gatherings as exercises in propriety, hierarchy, and observation. Every gesture, he anticipated, would carry weight beyond immediate appearance. Mrs. Havisham presided near the refreshment table, her hands poised on a linen napkin and her gaze surveying the assembled company with polite scrutiny. Mr. Fallow, seated at a distant bench, adjusted his spectacles in intervals that betrayed mild anxiety, while Mrs. Broadwater circulated quietly, nodding with courtesy yet maintaining an imperceptible tally of attentiveness. Purbright observed in his customary detached manner the micro-gestures, the tilt of a head, the slight contraction of a brow, the measured pacing of steps, each signaling unspoken judgments or faint perturbations. Conversation opened with customary remarks, weather, garden progress, and minor parish updates. Superficial, unobtrusive, and courteous, the exchanges masked an undercurrent of subtle competition. Mrs. Havisham complimented certain floral displays, yet her phrasing implied hierarchy, suggesting that excellence was to be acknowledged only when decorum permitted. Mr. Sims, the gardener, responded with a quiet nod, noting care in word choice and posture. Purbright catalogued each interaction, aware that Nethercombe's civility often conveyed more through restraint than expression. As tea was served, a discussion arose regarding the upcoming flower show and Harrow's recent involvement in committee decisions. The topic, though presented neutrally, revealed layers of implied censure and praise. Mr. Harrow had, naturally, a meticulous approach, Mrs. Broadwater remarked, voice gentle yet precise, which occasionally required adjustments from others. One trusts we have all observed proper procedure. The sentence was courteous, even flattering, yet Purbright detected a faint edge of moral judgment, directed as much at those present as at Harrow himself. A minor incident unfolded when a tray of sandwiches tipped slightly under the gentle weight of a porcelain teapot. The resulting correction, executed by Mrs. Havisham with impeccable calm, was accompanied by an almost imperceptible glance toward a younger committee member. Purbright, noting the gesture, reflected that minor corrections of movement often served as conduits for social instruction. In Nethercombe, moral authority was exercised through subtle observation and controlled interference rather than overt admonition. As the afternoon progressed, attention turned to the placement of garden chairs for an impromptu musical performance. Participants adjusted positions repeatedly, consulting one another with precise politeness. The inspector observed the layering of deference and assertion, small contests over visibility, prominence, and perceived propriety, executed with care, measured speech, and minimal deviation from etiquette. Each adjustment, while outwardly minor, revealed the priorities, alliances, and resentments within the village social structure. Purbright paused to note a conversation between Mrs. Broadwater and a visiting relative. Their words, cordial in tone, were punctuated by pauses and slight nods. When the relative gestured toward the west hedge, Mrs. Broadwater's hand briefly flicked toward her bosom, as if concealing or adjusting a note or document. The motion was fleeting, almost invisible to the casual observer, yet it suggested a deliberate intervention in the transmission of information, a subtle signal or precautionary measure. The inspector made a careful mental record. Such gestures, though minute, might reveal awareness of prior events, and perhaps even complicity in ongoing observation. Nearby, Mr. Sims tended the small tea urn, casting occasional glances toward the west hedge as if anticipating something imperceptible. His movements, though composed, were slightly accelerated in intervals, betraying quiet attention to detail beyond the immediate task. Purbright noted the alignment of their observation. Havisham, Broadwater, and Sims each monitored aspects of the garden and assembly with varying degrees of focus, suggesting that the village's social awareness extended even to objects, spaces, and unspoken cues. Toward the end of the gathering, the inspector's gaze fell upon a small bundle left beneath a garden bench. A sheet of folded paper protruded slightly, its edges worn, suggesting repeated handling. None of the villagers noticed its presence, though its placement near a cluster of chairs implied intentional concealment. Purbright approached quietly and lifted the sheet, noting faint pencil marks and annotations. The document's contents, though brief, hinted at observations previously unrecorded, the tracking of minor infractions, and a possible anticipation of behavior within the social L.A. Tice of Nethercombe. As the last of the visitors departed, the inspector lingered, surveying the landscape of lawn, hedge, and flower bed. Each element, carefully tended and precisely aligned, seemed imbued with social meaning. The interactions, gestures, and minor adjustments throughout the party had collectively revealed an intricate web of authority, observation, and subtle rivalry. Yet the bundle beneath the bench, the faintly annotated sheet, remained a small, almost imperceptible clue, a signal that some participant had not merely observed, but recorded, perhaps in anticipation of consequences yet unseen. Purbright straightened, considering the accumulation of small evidences, gestures, omissions, and precise calibrations of civility. Nethercombe, as always, spoke in whispers and silences, through minor disturbances and delicate corrections, and it seemed that the next step in the unfolding mystery would hinge upon those silent signals, carefully encoded and deliberately observed. Somewhere within the lattice of attention and propriety lay a thread, faint yet significant, waiting to reveal the intentions behind the village's calm, cultivated surface. The late afternoon sun cast long, measured shadows across the village green, bathing Nethercombe in a subdued, almost conspiratorial light. Inspector Purbright walked slowly along the perimeter, noting the subtle placement of benches, the careful alignment of flower beds, and the precise spacing of cobbled paths. Everything in the village bore the mark of attentive oversight, a meticulousness that, in combination with its residents' cultivated civility, suggested that even minor disturbances would ripple through social consciousness. Today, the inspector intended to observe rather than question, to read gestures and silences as one might a carefully composed ledger. A small group had gathered near the parish hall, ostensibly for a discussion of the upcoming bazaar. Mrs. Havisham presided with her usual air of exacting propriety, gloves folded and posture impeccable. Mr. Fallow adjusted his spectacles repeatedly, a subtle rhythm betraying a nervous anticipation that contrasted with the calm formality of his words. Purbright noted the alignment of attention. The villagers watched one another as much as they attended to the topic, subtle expressions signaling approval, hesitation, or veiled reproach. The inspector catalogued each micro-gesture, aware that Nethercombe's social lattice often revealed truth more reliably than speech. The discussion proceeded with careful circumspection. Remarks concerning allocations of stalls, arrangements of tables, and the distribution of duties were punctuated by pauses, glances, and faint nods that served both to maintain civility and to convey judgment. Mrs. Broadwater, speaking with measured courtesy, highlighted the importance of fairness, while subtly reinforcing her authority. It is, of course, most desirable that each contribution be acknowledged, yet we must ensure that propriety prevails. Purbright noted how the phrase "superficially neutral" contained a mild censure directed toward those who might be inclined to circumvent established order. A minor mishap occurred when a bundle of posters, unattended momentarily, tipped against a hedge. The incident drew immediate attention. Mrs. Havisham corrected the displacement with a precision that suggested both propriety and authority, while Mr. Sims cast a fleeting glance toward a nearby committee member. The subtle choreography of correction and observation, almost imperceptible, demonstrated the village's deep-seated calibration of social behavior. Even accidents were evaluated, corrected, and interpreted, each act a potential revelation of character or intent. Purbright moved quietly to a shaded bench at the edge of the green, from which he could observe multiple participants without attracting attention. His eyes catalogued the interactions, hands adjusting gloves, feet shifting under benches, the brief lifting of a brow in acknowledgement or disapproval. In Nethercombe, social navigation demanded constant attention, propriety, restraint, and observation intertwined to create an invisible lattice of expectation and control. Each resident, he observed, seemed simultaneously aware of his presence and acutely attentive to the impressions they conveyed. A conversation regarding a recent letter from the parish treasurer unfolded with exemplary politeness. The phrasing, carefully neutral, masked subtle differences of opinion. "One trusts that the figures have been verified," Mrs. Broadwater remarked, her intonation light but firm. Accuracy is, after all, a matter of collective responsibility. The observer would have perceived only courtesy. Purbright noted the understated nudge toward accountability and the gentle reminder of hierarchies. Small phrases in this environment were instruments of surveillance as potent as any overt directive. As the sun shifted, casting a golden slant across the green, Purbright observed a minute detail that might have escaped casual notice. Mrs. Havisham, reaching for a cup of tea, allowed a folded sheet of paper to protrude slightly from beneath her hand. Her motion was almost imper,